Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us on your Saturday morning. We just started the webinar, so I'll give it a few seconds for folks to trickle in, and then we will get started with some housekeeping stuff. Yes, welcome, welcome, welcome. Alrighty, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started here since it is 10:01. So greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us again on your Saturday morning. Welcome to the last webinar of our second annual Field Inclusive Week. We are excited for you to meet our speakers momentarily. My name is Lauren D. Pharr. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a current third-year PhD student at North Carolina State University, pursuing my degree in Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. I am also a co-founder and CFO of Field Inclusive, a young nonprofit working towards amplifying and supporting marginalized and historically excluded biologists and researchers who professionally work outdoors. Just so you are aware, today's webinar will be recorded, and all of our webinars from this week will be posted to our YouTube channel. So be sure you follow us there for easy access to these recordings again. Shortly, I will introduce our speakers, but first, I would like to give a special thanks to our sponsor of Field Inclusive Week 2024, the Nature Conservancy. Thank you for coming on board as our sponsor for the second year and for being dedicated to promoting and supporting a more inclusive outdoors. It is through organizations like yours and the many individuals who donate to support Field Inclusive's mission that we can continue our goals in raising awareness when it comes to social field safety issues by hosting events like Field Inclusive Week, as well as providing financial support to marginalized and historically excluded individuals who professionally work outdoors. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's discussion. Katie O'Donnell is a decision analyst at Compass Resource Management in Vancouver, BC, where she helps manage groups structure their decisions and find collaborative solutions to complex natural resource management problems. She's an active member of the Wildlife Society and is a co-founder of the Out in the Field initiative, which promotes visibility and community building for LGBTQ+ wildlifers and TWS. Colleen Olfenbuttel has worked in the wildlife profession for over 25 years and has co-authored over 30 peer-reviewed scientific publications. She has been the black bear and fur bear biologist for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission since 2007 and is responsible for managing and conserving black bears and 17 fur bear species. Colleen is a co-founder of the Wildlife Society's Out in the Field initiative, past president for the North Carolina chapter of the Wildlife Society, chair of TWS Wildlife Damage Management Working Group, and a certified wildlife biologist. She is also a counselor for the International Bear Association. A huge welcome and special thanks to our speakers today for agreeing to share their time and expertise and experiences with our audience members. Audience members, please feel free to submit questions for our speakers for the Q&A portion, which will be towards the end of our discussion today. Now, without further ado, I will pass it off to our speakers. And again, just to reiterate, for our audience members, as you listen to the conversation, we invite you to please place your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar for our speakers to answer during the Q&A portion. All right, we will start off with Katie, so take it away.
Thank you so much. Just give me a thumbs up, make sure I'm sharing correctly. And thank you so much to Field Inclusive for the invitation. Colleen and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all this morning. So as I was introduced, I'm Katie O'Donnell, use she, her pronouns, and I'm coming to you this morning from Vancouver, BC. As was mentioned in our introductions, a little bit of context for this talk before I get going. Colleen and I are both wildlife biologists, part of the Wildlife Society, or TWS, which we'll refer to a lot, and two of the four co-founders of Out in the Field, which we'll be talking about, which is an initiative within TWS to increase visibility and inclusion for LGBTQ+ folks in the wildlife field. So I'm going to take the first part of the talk and then hand it over to Colleen for the second. Before we get going, I wanted to mention or just clarify, what are we talking about when we are talking about LGBTQ+? LGBTQ+, it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and the plus stands for related identities. So things like intersex and asexual, and lots of other terms that are sort of under this umbrella. You often see a lot of variants of this term. I think LGBTQ plus is becoming sort of the most preferred or most common, but there's other initialisms that you might see. So people include the I and the A. Sometimes it's just referred to as sexual and gender minorities, or SOGI or SGM, or just the queer community. And I will sometimes just say queer as opposed to LGBTQ plus. And this is just a reminder that these preferred terms for the community and for individuals can evolve over time and really vary from person to person. Okay, so with that in mind, the first part of this talk is going to be on the field history aspect, which we know is the theme of the day in this Field Inclusive Week. And when we were first approached about talking about this topic, trying to highlight folks with marginalized identities who textbooks often leave out, right, especially in the natural resources. My first thought was about the experience that I had contributing to a book chapter. This book, which I also have a copy of here. This effort started back in late 2018, and the book was published just before the TWS conference in 2022, in late 2022. So the book is called Women in Wildlife Science, Building Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and it's edited by Carol Chambers and Carrie Nicholson. So there's two sections in the book. The first section is called Breaking Ground and Presenting Facts. So this is more about the history of women in wildlife and kind of setting up the stage, like what's the current challenge to building equity, diversity, and inclusion in the field. And then the second section is called Diverse Perspectives and Practical Acts. And in this section, a lot of these chapters focus on various identities. So there's a chapter contributed by Native women in wildlife, one on women of color in wildlife, and our chapter on called Breaking the Binary, which is about LGBTQ plus wildlife perspectives. And then there's a millennial chapter, and then again some some chapters about practical acts to build a more inclusive and equitable future. So the editors of this book asked each of these chapters to include vignettes about just this idea. So, as you're reading through a chapter, sometimes there's a little box that is a little profile on somebody. And they asked us to try and include vignettes about this idea, like who are women, or in our case, queer folks, who are left out of history books, right? Who we would like to feature within each of these chapters. The problem with our chapter was that we couldn't think of any. Within the wildlife profession, we could not think of anybody that was an out, queer member of the community. That there are people we might speculate about, but nobody that we knew of for sure. So this just really highlighted for us that it was a real big challenge to identify historical figures in wildlife science who were LGBTQ plus. So our answer to this was actually to write a hypothetical profile. We, wanted to emphasize that we've always been here, and that especially for LGBTQ plus folks who, this identity can often be invisible. It's not always very apparent. That there are probably a lot of folks who have been really integral members of the society that were queer, that we just don't know about because they weren't open about it and weren't willing to, didn't feel comfortable sharing that part of themselves with their colleagues. And so around the time that we started this effort, this book chapter, was right around the time that we started out in the field as well. And so Colleen will be talking more about out in the field and what we've been doing with that group to, simply, that's why one of our goals, our first goal, is simply to increase visibility of LGBTQ plus wildlifers in the field. So again, Colleen will be talking a little bit more about how we've been doing that. However, so for other chapters that we're focusing on other identities, including just the overarching focus of this book on women in wildlife, some of these authors dug up some really great examples of folks who have been overlooked in the history of our field, especially the authors of this chapter, chapter 2, which is called Trailblazers, Women Who Forged a Path in Wildlife History. So this chapter was written by Winnie Kessler and Selma Glasscock. And I was just rereading this chapter over the past few days to kind of, come up with some more examples and to share for this talk. And so I want to just share a few that I've learned about reading through this book, especially from this chapter here. So start here with Elizabeth Beard Losey. Elizabeth was the first woman to get a Master of Science degree in Wildlife Management and Conservation from the University of Michigan. After she graduated, though, the Michigan State Game Division wouldn't hire her because they, quote, "it would be inappropriate because the field work would involve long hours and possible overnight stays with male associates." Right? So that's the type of pushback that women, especially in sort of the earlier 1900s, were facing in this field. However, Elizabeth went on to become the first female wildlife biologist within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and actually became the first female member of the Wildlife Society itself back in 1948. Another woman featured in this book is Joyce McTaggart Cowan. Her husband, Ian, is a very famous wildlife biologist in Canada, especially. And I highlighted Joyce because she's somebody who, she's emblematic of a lot of women of this era who didn't get professional recognition because she didn't have academic credentials, right? But she had learned a whole lot of field skills and animal identification and things like that from her childhood growing up. Her father was sort of in the field, and so she contributed a huge amount to her husband's work, but and her husband credited her, but she didn't get the professional recognition that she really deserved simply because she didn't have an academic degree in that field. So again, these are just emblematic of a lot of other women of that era. One of the last major ones that I want to feature is Lucille Ferrier-Stickle. Lucille was a pioneer in the field of wildlife toxicology. So her work actually was a really big influence and helped inform and confirm some of the things in Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. Lucille was the first woman she ended up being the first woman to be the lead of a national research lab. So a lot of folks in the wildlife field know very well the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, and she was the director of Patuxent for about 10 years. Initially, she followed her husband there. He got a job there, but very interesting that she herself ended up being the director of that lab. And they now actually, at Patuxent, there is a lab named after them, the Stickle Lab. Lucille was also the first woman to receive the highest honor from TWS. It's known as the Aldo Leopold Memorial Award, and it's given out once a year to honor sort of a career of work in the wildlife field. And she was the first woman to receive this award from TWS back in 1974. So Elizabeth, the first person I showed, was the first woman to be a member of TWS in 1948. And about 25 years later, we had our first woman win the highest honor from TWS. I also wanted to highlight a little more recent history that, you know, kind of sounds great. You know, okay, 1974, we had a woman win the Aldo Leopold Award. However, since then, there's only been two more. Winnie Kessler won back in 2017. So it was from 1974 all the way to 2017 before there was another woman member, or another woman who won this award. So Winnie Kessler won it back in 2017. And Winnie was also the second woman to be the president of TWS. And you may recognize her name from just a couple of minutes ago, because she was the lead author on this chapter that I'm highlighting these folks from. And just this year, or well, I guess last year in 2023, the Aldo Leopold Award was given to Carol Chambers. So she became the third woman to win this award. She was also the third woman to serve as president of TWS. And you might recognize her name because she was the lead editor of this book that I'm featuring. Just wanted to briefly highlight a few other folks that, you know, either I've come across in my own history or that were mentioned in this book. And I swear I'm not getting any, you know, proceeds or anything from this book, but I think, you know, I encourage everybody to get it, because it is a great start at sort of highlighting and featuring some of these names that we wouldn't maybe otherwise hear about. And it really brings a lot of these people together all in one place and lays out a really important history. So briefly, I wanted to highlight Marjorie Harris Carr, who before I moved to Vancouver, I was actually down in Florida, and I learned a lot about Marjorie Harris Carr. She was the first female wildlife technician at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And she did her grad program at the University of Florida. And at the time, UF was still an all-male institution. But because her husband, who is a very well-known herpetologist named Archie Carr, because of his reputation within the biology department, she was able to leverage that and get into a grad program. Fast forward, she had a tremendous career as an environmental activist and co-founded the Florida Defenders of the Environment. And today there's a 110-mile greenway in Florida that's named for her. Two other women that are actually authors of one of the chapters in the book that I keep mentioning. One, Mamie Parker, somebody who will be in the future history books that are being written now. Really long career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Mamie was the first African American to be a regional director within that agency. So she served as the regional director for the Northeast region of Fish and Wildlife Service. And another author of that chapter, Audrey Peterman, who is a fantastic speaker and an author, and founded the Diverse Environmental Leaders Speakers Bureau. So these are just, you know, a few of the awesome women and people that you can, you know, learn a little bit more about through this book. So earlier a few slides ago, I mentioned the challenge of identifying that we had identifying historical queer figures in wildlife. And so we wrote this hypothetical profile. But I do want to highlight a co-author of the chapter that I was involved in. And Colleen will talk a little bit, I think was going to mention him as well, but Travis Booms is now a good friend of ours. I'm proud to call him a friend. And he took a huge step within TWS in writing about his perspectives as a gay wildlife biologist. And so this was an article that was in the TWS Professional Society magazine, which is called The Wildlife Professional. And he wrote this back in, I believe it was 2017 or 2018. And Travis, along with Colleen and myself, is one of the co-founders of Out in the Field. And but it takes people like Travis, stepping up and saying, as the title of this piece says, I am one of you. Like we have always been here, but he was closeted for a long time, or at least not really out to his colleagues or and so this article talks about how he navigated some difficult situations in the field. So I just wanted to highlight Travis, and then at this point I will turn it over to Colleen, who's going to talk more about some of our work with Out in the Field and how we're trying to increase visibility of LGBTQ plus wildlifers, and first of all why we need to do that. So I will stop sharing my screen and let Colleen take it from here.
All right. Thanks, Katie. All right, let me share my screen. All right. Okay. Yeah, so I'm Colleen Olfenbuttel, go by she, her pronouns. And yeah, now kind of shifting from the history, which as you've seen, thankfully it's growing for women in wildlife, still has a lot more potential, but we still see an issue with the lack of known historical figures that were out as queer. We suspect there are quite a few of them in the history of not only wildlife but natural resources. Unfortunately, back then, the ramifications of being out were pretty high. So hopefully we're going to start to change that. But one, I want to talk about the need for LGBTQ plus inclusion. One, I work for a state wildlife agency, and my agency, as well as all the other wildlife agencies, whether they're at the state or federal level, we are responsible for managing and conserving the wildlife resources of North America. We have a big responsibility. We do it on behalf of the public, but an increasing issue that thankfully people are recognizing is that the public is a lot more diverse than the wildlife profession itself. That's a problem. We're seeing that at the same time that the public is more diverse than the wildlife profession, that we're seeing an increase in people that identify as LGBTQ plus. In a 2021 Gallup poll, about 5.6% of US adults identified as LGBTQ plus. But what I really want to focus in on is Gen Z. Those are people kind of in their late teens to early 20s. 21% identify as LGBTQ plus. And I want to highlight Gen Z because, at least in the wildlife profession, those are our undergraduate students in wildlife. Those are even our graduate students in wildlife. Those are our next generation of wildlife professionals. And as they go from undergrad to graduate and become early career professionals, it's important that they feel included in the wildlife profession because we need to maintain them as we face growing challenges with natural resources. At the same time, we're seeing some good news. We're seeing that just as we see more people identify and feel comfortable identifying as LGBTQ+, they're doing that because there is increased acceptance of LGBTQ+ people, at least in the United States. This is just an example of that increasing support, where this is a question that the Gallup poll asked back in 2021 about support for the right for LGBTQ+ to be married. And we see by that green line that a majority, in fact, 70% of the general public supports that same-sex couples should have the same rights as traditional methods. So that's great news. However, we still see a lot of variation among states in their tolerance for LGBTQ+ people, especially when we look at laws regarding the prohibition of discrimination. So despite the increase in support we're seeing from US adults, increase in people that are identifying as LGBTQ+, we still see a variation in state laws. And this can really impact how LGBTQ+ students and even wildlife professionals feel about being fully open to their colleagues, being open in the workplace, being open in the classroom, to their fellow students, to their fellow coworkers, because there is a lack of legal protections in many, many states. There's been surveys that have been conducted, one of which reported that anywhere between 42 to 68% of LGBTQ+ individuals reported discrimination in the workplace. When we look at transgender people in particular, 90% report harassment and discrimination in the workplace. There was a study conducted in the United Kingdom that specifically looked at LGBTQ+ scientists, and 30% said they had considered leaving the workplace because they viewed it as hostile or unfriendly, or even they did experience discrimination. But the common theme here is that LGBTQ+ wildlifers do feel they will face repercussions if they are out or if they are outed by a colleague. They have concerns about their safety. They have concerns about career advancements. They have concerns about harassment and, of course, discrimination. So what we see is this lack of historic figures that were LGBTQ+. There's still issues even today where LGBTQ+ wildlifers who are doing amazing things still don't feel they can be open and out because of concerns that they have from doing so. The other reason we need more inclusion is because there remain, as much as we've seen an increase in support for LGBTQ+ wildlifers, we still see that there are different perspectives of how inclusive the conservation field actually is. And so we worked with some researchers, Abby Fricka, who is cited in the next few slides, and her colleagues. They did surveys of people in the conservation field, both those that identified as heterosexual and those that identified as queer. And it was really interesting. She presented these results at the TWS conference in Louisville back in November of 2023. And currently the results are in review for publication. So keep an eye out for that publication. But she allowed us to share some of the results, even so her paper isn't published quite yet. And I think the most interesting kind of take-home message, there's lots of cool results from her survey, but kind of, I think, to Katie and I, some of the big take-home message is that when you looked at, how inclusive is the conservation field for those with LGBTQ+ identities, there was a much different perspective based off if you identified as heterosexual versus queer. And what we see here in these two slides is that, for instance, those who strongly agreed that the conservation field was inclusive for queers, 75% of those were heterosexual versus queer. And then when we look at how inclusive, based off of gender identity, so whether you're gender expansive or you identify as cisgender, we see that 100% of people who identified as cisgender strongly agreed that the conservation field was inclusive for queer identities. So certainly different perspectives, obviously because different experiences. So there is a need to maybe educate our allies on more work that needs to be done to make the conservation field more inclusive. The other need is when you actually ask queer wildlifers or queer people in the natural resource field, as Katie did a couple years ago, you need to hear from them what they're experiencing. So back in what I think fall of 2020 and then also May of 2021, Katie actually crowdsourced answers from Twitter about what do you wish your coworkers knew? And I think, even from my perspective, being, I identify as lesbian, I can relate to these, but it's still like, yeah, boy, I'm seeing how I've experienced my career in life in these answers. And again, this is just a few years ago. So you can see the various answers, including being trans in the field is a challenge. I'm scared of applying to jobs in rural settings. Another who says that the lack of LGBTQIA plus representation in my group is intimidating. Another one, an undergraduate student, was fairly explicit in her question, as you see here. She asked, do I have to change my major because I'm gay? Because she wasn't seeing herself represented in the field. So yeah, we need work to do. Overall, the themes we've seen from the research that Abby did, from Katie's questions, from just our experience as queer wildlifers, the input we're getting from as OITF organizers, these are the main things is why we need more inclusion. And that is one, there is a lack of representation. A lot of queer wildlifers don't feel they can be their authentic self. They do feel that there's still discrimination that can limit job opportunities and advancements. But they're also seeing that your experience will depend on how you identify. Someone who identifies as by he, him pronouns and is gay might experience something different than someone that has they, them pronouns and identifies as transgender. We have seen, though, historically, the wildlife field has been less inclusive of women, and probably within women, those that identify as lesbian. And the last thing is, I think a lot of us have experienced that we do what we call performative inclusion. And if you're wondering what that is, that's basically changing your pronoun or the pronoun of your significant other, if you have one, to fit into a space, to belong, or to just be safe. And I can give you so many examples in my lifetime of which I felt the need to do that, either to be safe or to feel a sense of belonging, where, for years, I would change the pronoun of my significant other or refer to her as Jess instead of Jessica. So it wasn't obvious that my partner was a woman and not a man, as was expected. Thankfully, I have not done that for many years. I've reached a point in my career where I feel comfortable and confident that I can be out, and to be honest, that I don't care what other people think. I'm going to be who I want to be. But a lot of other queer wildlifers, for various reasons, are not in the same position I now am in. So they kind of have to, unfortunately, fake it to make it, and that's not good. And then the last reason we need is just there is still blatant discrimination, blatant harassment, blatant hate occurring against LGBTQ+ people. With this being an example, probably most of you heard about this event occurring in 2022, where there is actually, arrests made for people that wanted to do some violent harm at a pride parade in Idaho. So what are we doing, to create a more inclusive environment for queer wildlifers? Well, that's what I'm wearing today. The Wildlife Society's Out in the Field initiative, in which we want to support our queer wildlifers. Katie already mentioned it, but the start was back in 2019 when the article she referred to by Travis Boons was published in our professional organization's magazine. I remember when it hit my mailbox, I was got it, opened it up, and I saw Travis's articles and just was overwhelmed with emotions that he was willing to out himself. And in that article, not only did he out himself, tell other wildlifers that queer wildlifers are just like them, and that we do exist. But the other thing he did is he made a call that if there are other queer wildlifers in the wildlife profession, he said he challenged us to build a community because none existed, at least none existed that he knew of. And guess what? Some of us heard that call, featured here, one of them, Katie, but as well as Claire Crow. We heeded that call. We contacted Travis and we said, what can we do? We've got to do something. And so we started the Out in the Field Initiative. So the Out in the Field Initiative, again, is part of the Wildlife Society. We created it, again, as Katie mentioned, so that queer wildlifers could be more visible so that we can support and mentor each other. But we also created it so that we could work with our allies to foster an inclusive and welcoming environment. And how we're going to do that is by hopefully meeting our 3 goals that are listed here. 1, increase visibility of LGBTQ+ wildlifers in the Wildlife Society and hopefully beyond. 1, once we're more visible, then we can start to build a community of LGBTQ+ wildlifers. And in that way, we can then achieve our 3rd goal, which is to create support for LGBTQ+ wildlifers, including students in the wildlife profession. Because again, the students are the next generation of wildlifers. We need them to stay in. We need the best of the best to stay in the wildlife profession, to face the future challenges we're all facing due to climate change, habitat destruction, et cetera, et cetera. So as I mentioned, this got started in 2019 with the inaugural event at the 2019 Wildlife Society joint conference with the American Fisheries Society. It was the first joint conference between the 2 natural resource organizations in many, many years. It was in Reno, Nevada. And the 4 of us, Travis, Katie, Claire, and myself, decided, yeah, let's do a luncheon with free pizza, because who doesn't want free pizza? Maybe we'll get like 20 people to show up. And that's really, we weren't sure what to expect, but we thought maybe 20, 30 people would show up at best. We thought, well, if it's just the 4 of us, we could eat pizza and talk. And thankfully, we were wrong in our expectations. We had over 100 people show up. So you can see they crowded the room, more tables had to be brought in, more pizza ordered. We had TWS leadership show up. And it really showed we were onto something. It also showed the desire and need for this initiative within the Wildlife Society. And then since then, we've kind of been on a roll. I will say our conferences are kind of the big part of this initiative because these conferences are the largest gathering of wildlife professionals. So in 2022, when we had our first in-person conference after COVID in Spokane, we also did a luncheon, and there we drew 200+ people, as well as we had specific events just for LGBTQ+ wildlifers. So again, we could build that community. Fast forward to the conference in Louisville, we switched it up to an evening reception. Again, not sure how things would go. We had in all, during the evening reception, 300 people show up at our reception, as well as we had separate events. Again, it's been really gratifying to see the support, as well as see the growing number of queer wildlifers, in particular students and early career professionals, that are really excited about our initiative. We do other things to try to build our community, and that is our virtual socials. We started this during COVID-19, but we've continued because TWS is considered an international organization. So with these virtual socials, we can go not only reach across the United States, but into Canada and beyond. So we can all bring queer wildlifers together just to bond and talk. Our main portal for resources is our website. This is our website, wildlife.org/OITF. There you'll see who our organizers are. We have grown in the number of organizers and their contact information. So anything you want to know about OITF can be found at this website. But the other way we're trying to reach out is through our social media platforms, Twitter, which is now X, and then of course Instagram. And I'll be showing this in the last slide of this presentation. So you'll be seeing this again. We do have an OITF packet. And basically what this packet is it's so that maybe we can have OITF events and socials and webinars outside of the annual conference. So that if you want to do it, within your club, within your school, within your state chapter, within whatever, you can have OITF events. And it just has this packet information on how to increase visible support for queer wildlifers, as well as how we can increase the visibility of queer wildlifers, as well as other guidance that can be really helpful to those that want to be allies and support their queer wildlifers. The good news is it's not just the Wildlife Society and the wildlife profession specifically we're seeing this in. Katie and I and others, we've really seen support for queer people and natural resources grow. And this is just a handful of organizations, both professional organizations such as the American Fisheries Society and the Society for American Foresters, as well as just natural resource nonprofits and organizations that are focused on supporting queers that, love the natural resource field or just want to be outdoors more. So these are examples of that. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Field Inclusive is a perfect example of that increased support for queer wildlifers. So this is my last slide because of course we want to leave room for any questions or comments. But this is showing all the resources I kind of mentioned. First and foremost are the organizers, Katie, myself, and the other organizers that are on the website. If people want us to do webinars, talk about how, what allies can do to support queer wildlifers, we're there for you. Contact us. We would love to help provide those resources, whether it's a webinar, presentation, or just guidance. Please contact us. And also at the very bottom, I also, again, wanted to plug the Women in Wildlife book, or, Women in Wildlife Sciences. I believe there's a link to it in the chat. So yeah, I encourage you to look up that book. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. And then, yeah, I'll let Lauren take over.
Lauren, you're muted.
Oh gosh, I'm muted. Thank you both, Colleen and Katie. That was a fabulous presentation. And it really has given us a lot to think about, as allies, on how better we can support the LGBTQ community as well. So thank you so much. We did place that link in the chat for that book also. I was a reviewer for that book, so I can hands down say that it is a fabulous, fabulous resource. All right, so we will now jump into our Q&A portion here. And so we have some great Q&As in the chat. So again, audience members, please place your Q&As in the Q&A portion of the chat. So our first question to you both here, how do you handle pushback from people who do not see the need for inclusion initiatives such as out in the field? And this was actually a great question because it kind of goes along with a question that myself and Field Inclusive actually had, as far as, have you, into your experience of creating, out in the field under TWS, because I'm sure we all know and are all aware of, TWS and their background with having this, white male dominated outlook on things. So was there any kinds of pushbacks or hurdles that you had to overcome with that?
I can take a first stab and then I saw this question come in while Colleen was still talking, so I had a minute to think about it. And this is a great question, really. And the first thing that came to mind is allies. That we rely a lot on having really strong allies. I mentioned Carol Chambers earlier. Like that's a great example. She was somebody who was, I think when we started out in the field, she had just been elected. Like it was clear she was going to be president of TWS. And so we've had, I will say at the top level of TWS, we've had really strong support for out in the field. But yeah, we know there's people out there who, don't think that we need to exist, or that we have to kind of prove that it is important. And that's why, we thought a lot about what our goals were of our initiative when we first started. And that's why we just started with, what sounds simple, but just visibility, just increasing visibility. And so I think Colleen mentioned, when we're at the conference, we wear these rainbow LGBTQ ribbons to just say, hey, we are here. And this has just snowballed over the last several years, and to the point where, we see, the last 2 years, we've had other people who are not organizers, if they're willing to wear a ribbon, they can come up and get a ribbon from us. And so all of a sudden you start, it just makes it a lot more, you can't ignore it. And so you're starting to see, hopefully that's starting to change some people's minds. If there are some of those holdouts, who can kind of just see like, wow, there's a lot of energy and effort around this. And I think a lot of our activities kind of speak for themselves in that way. But Colleen, I'm sure you might have something to add.
Yeah, it is a good question. And it's kind of one. The good news is things are changing. Here's a good example of how things have changed. Back, I want to say 2011, 2012, I was at a TWS conference, and an ally came up who said, hey, there's LGBTQ plus social tonight. Do you know about it? And I said, and obviously I was out, so they knew to talk to me about it. And I, started thinking like, who organized this? What's it going to be? I kind of got excited because I didn't know many people back then at all. And I show up, and there's one other person. There's one other queer person who was a younger professional, early career. And then there's like 5 straight people, allies. And it was a bust. Now, again, hearts were in the right place. But I think what's changed over time and what's needed, not only for us as queer wildlifers, but for any underrepresented or marginalized group, is sometimes the grassroots efforts from those of us ourselves. And that's why, Katie and myself and Claire and Travis said, we've got to do this ourselves, because we know from our personal experiences what is needed. And so we are trying to build that community so that others don't have to go through what we did, whether that's, hesitation to be closeted, that they can feel comfortable being their authentic selves, and it's not even a question. And again, how are things different now? We have over 300 people show up at our event in 2023. We went from just maybe passing out, I don't know, 10, 20, and, LGBT plus name tag ribbons to so you self-identify and be visible, to well over 100 in Louisville. So things are changing for the good, but yeah, there's still issues that I can talk about, examples of, getting those questions of why the need, and why do you have to, show your sexuality all over the place. And to be honest, I confront those people and basically say, because at least in the wildlife field, we do work intimately with others. You're in the airplane with someone for hours. You're in the truck with someone for hours. You're not just going to talk about wildlife. You're going to talk about your life. And people need to make sure that they can be their authentic self and not hide it. Because if they're hiding themselves, you're not knowing who they truly are, and they can't be their best selves, their best wildlife professional. But things are changing. I will say, I have been surprised within state wildlife agencies, in particular in the Southeast, how it's much more welcoming maybe than people think it is. And I will say, maybe I'm plugging the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, my employer, but I have found a very welcoming environment, thankfully, in that agency.
No, that's fabulous. And building off of that, it's like you're saying with your story, how that first event, that you went to, there was only 2 of you. And then now, like the one in Louisville, as you said, it was huge. And it took that, just seeing that, it definitely shows other people like, oh, like, okay, these people are showing up for this, like this must be a serious thing, which it is. So I want to thank, you both again for all of the work that you're putting into this to make a safe space, for this community, for sure. Our next question here. So how do you balance visibility and vulnerability? Being a gender or sexual minority in STEM can be very difficult, from unwelcoming work environments and verbal microaggressions to direct threats to safety and harassment. How do you personally protect your well-being while still being out and proud?
Yeah, another really great question. I think, at least for Colleen and I, you know, starting out in the field, like we were, at least, well, I'll just speak for myself, I guess. Um, I'm at a point in my career, like I have that. I mean, I feel very privileged that I can be out and that I have an employer who is super, supportive, and like there's a copy of our book on our coffee table in our office, and um, it's but I think it's, yeah. So at least for me, a lot of it has to do with the stage of my career that I'm at, the stage of my life that I'm at. Um, I feel okay being a little more visible and vulnerable, or because I don't feel as vulnerable, because of that. Um, yeah, but Colleen, I'll let you
Yeah.
speak to your own experience as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll say this, it's still a problem. And I will say, am I out in my profession? Yes, I'm out in my agency. I'm out, of course, with Wildlife Society and other organizations I'm involved with. Am I out when I go in the field and I'm interacting with, say, hunters or trappers? Usually not. Usually if they make a comment about, what does your husband think of you working by yourself out in the woods? I'm not going to correct them for the most part, just because that is a very vulnerable position to be in. And so I wish I could say I was out in every aspect, but no, the reality is no, there are still places where I have to not be out. Now, I've seen there's been benefits and drawbacks to me being identified as a cisgender woman. The benefit is, I'm not obviously a lesbian. So as I said before, you sometimes you kind of can stay hidden and you have to stay safe. But of course there's drawbacks too, of course, with being a woman in the wildlife field, real safety risks that I'm very cognizant of. And I will say one thing I have really encouraged in my workplace is that no one should be working by themselves. Whether you're you're cisgender, male, female, or non-binary, no one should be working in the field by themselves. But the reality is in wildlife with limited funding, sometimes that's not possible. So in my workforce, I've said, okay, if we have to work by ourselves, it has to be situations where we know where we are at all times, where each other are at times, and setting those safety mechanisms in place. But to be honest, I think it is trying to encourage people to work together as a pair, not only just harassment maybe from people you encounter, but of course just regular safety hazards in the field, tripping and falling or getting bitten by a rattlesnake, etc. We should really be encouraging that, as well as when it comes to maybe harassment in the workplace. As Katie mentioned, that's where allies really come into play, where if an ally sees harassment, even if they're on the periphery, please say something, do something, be there, support them. And even I know as a queer, I can be an ally for other queers maybe facing harassment. So that's again where allies are really important.
I actually just want to add to that, along this theme of sort of safety in numbers, I think that goes for sort of out in the field as well. Like that, at first, Colleen described that first luncheon in Reno, and we were not sure, just how sort of visible we would be, like how much we would stand out. And then, but when you feel this huge crowd come, you just all of a sudden realize, like, oh, okay, like that there is safety in those numbers, that it is just kind of that undeniable group safety.
Yeah, and then, well, and speaking of, this really segs way into this next question. speaking of, and about allies. So, and this next question we have here, and it kind of ties into one that Field Inclusive, one of our questions has, we have as well. How can allies better support LGBTQ plus students and coworkers? And then building off of that, how can organizations, institutions, allies make sure that they are supporting someone who may not be comfortable coming out yet, or as Colleen mentioned, being their authentic selves, but we still want to make sure that the environment is safe for them? Any ideas or tips or suggestions?
I feel bad keep going first, but I don't mind. Yeah, I mean, we have all kinds of ideas for allies and ways to be supportive. We actually went through a few scenarios even in our book chapter. I'm sorry to keep plugging the book, but it's we put a lot of work into it. So we have some scenarios of like trying to, as an ally, like trying to imagine yourself in this scenario, like what would you do? Like practice using other pronouns, like and in general though, I just pulled up, one of the lists of things that allies can do a lot is just like be conscious of your own biases, using inclusive language, seek out other perspectives, like watch a documentary or a show that you wouldn't normally watch. Just learn about, other, people with marginalized identities, and then as an ally, be visible. Like we hand out those rainbow pins, and that goes for allies too. You don't have to be queer to wear one of those pins. Like wear that, put that on, put a sticker on your office door, and then the biggest thing I think is just recognizing that we all make mistakes. A lot of people are really scared to make mistakes, or like say the wrong thing, or like, oh, I'm going to use the wrong pronoun or say the wrong word or whatever. We all make mistakes. Like that happens, and that's fine. The biggest thing to do is just apologize quickly, move on, and then learn from it. And that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because we actually had some slides about how to be an ally, but we realized we didn't have time. So, but that could be another presentation in the future. But just, I think, be an ally, don't assume a straight environment. Don't assume all your colleagues are straight. Don't assume all your students are straight. Don't make that assumption. So, we've heard students say, that, yeah, they love their advisor, but their advisor's like, yeah, come on over, to my barbecue, and make sure you bring your boyfriend, like, don't assume. Just say, hey, come on over and bring who you want. It's as simple as that, just simple terminology, not being specific. Just don't assume that straight world. And again, it sounds so simple. Katie touched on it. Sounds simple, but being visible with your support. And we do know that there's allies that they know maybe their student or colleague is queer, but for some reason their colleague or student hasn't outed themselves. That's fine. Doesn't say anything about you. It's their journey, not yours. But just putting a sticker on your door, or yeah, wearing the pin at the, Wildlife Society conference or other things is a nice signal. And we hear that time and time again from queer wildlifers, in particular younger students, that when they go to visit a college and they go down that hallway and they see someone with a rainbow flag on their door, it makes a tremendous difference in how they feel about going to that school or not. Because it's like, wow, okay, that professor feels comfortable doing that. Maybe I can be a part of this school. I can be a student here. It's really low-hanging fruit, but again, we can do another presentation on that, as well as we have resources on our website.
No, that is great. I mean, and speaking of, like you said, low-hanging fruit, and now we're talking about students, it segues into another question that we have. So what advice do you both have for young queer students and professionals to find community and support, whether that be at their institution? So again, Colleen and Katie, both, you talked about the simplest thing, having like a sticker outside your door that has the flag, that just brings that big comfort, to students to feel, that, to make sure that they feel that they're safe and everything like that. So any other advice for, institutions and organizations when it comes to finding community for young queer students?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if you're, if you are a young queer student or a professional, uh, you know, even if you're not a wildlife professional, but you're sort of in this natural resource realm, you know, we're trying to be that resource for sure, and provide that community. We actually have our next virtual social on Monday, which is for limited to folks who identify as LGBTQ plus. So if you follow us on social media, and you can sign up for our email list. That's the easiest way to find out about our events. And but there are, Colleen mentioned some other organizations that you can also kind of seek out. And but that's something that we've tried. We know there are some schools that may not have a big community, or some workplaces that might not have a big community, but a lot of places do. If you start seeking them out, like there are employee resource groups and community organizations. And then and if you are in an area that there really isn't much, then we're trying to provide that sort of virtual touch point to build community.
Yeah, I'm going to acknowledge something. It is tough for us to create a community because we are fairly invisible. Um, so it's even hard for us to identify each other. Of course, we all talk about our gaydar, but still, we're not obviously visible. So that's why it makes it hard to create a community. Again, we're hoping not only our initiative, but the other initiatives we're starting to see, including Field Inclusive. And I'm going to put one, Seeing the Forest for the Queers, which is a queer community within the Forest Steward Guilds. Hopefully, we're starting to build that up. I will say, at least from OITF, we are trying to get it so that not just National Wildlife Society, but all the subunits that exist, because there are lots of subunits based off region, state, and even university, that if you're a student at a university with a student chapter of the Wildlife Society, trying to get those student chapters, both the student leaders within them, as well as their advisor, to try to promote a more inclusive environment, in particular for queer students, by having OITF events, by showing visible support. So then within that, student chapter, a community can start to be built. But again, yeah, we have that for our first 2024 social this Monday night. You can find out details about it on our Twitter and Instagram. But we're working on it. But yeah, there's a lot of work to do. If you don't have a community right now in natural resources, come to us. We'll give you a big old hug. You can be part of our family.
No, I love that. I love that. So we are a little bit over time, but we have one more question. If you both would like to stick around and just answer this last question for us, it would be greatly appreciated. Related to visibility and vulnerability, in my experiences being the token queer, the only one of my identity in a space, often used by others to promote how diverse and accepting the environment may be, has brought a lot of mental baggage. Well-meaning people will ask me questions about my identity, and while I appreciate their curiosity and desire to understand, it can feel very invasive and uncomfortable. How do you balance the desire to educate and advocate with personal boundaries and privacy?
That is hard. That is a hard question. And yeah, first of all, for whoever asked that, I'm sorry that you have experienced that, and that you've gone through that experience. It is, it is frustrating to be, tokenized. And I think any of us with marginalized identities who, kind of speak out or advocate for greater inclusion, are at risk of becoming, the token queer, or the token, whatever it is, whatever identity we hold. And I would just, at least on a personal level, just say, like, you really do have to prioritize your own your own mental health, and it, without knowing more about the situation, I can't give specifics, but it's my instinct would be to talk to somebody in charge who is, find some of those well-meaning people, and maybe say, like, how can I get you know, like that, just having like having sort of a rehearsed answer or response to things like that, like that's a personal question. Um, can go a long way, and just sort of establishing a boundary and say, that's an personal question. I'd rather not I'd rather not answer that. Or, you know, have a resource in mind that you could point them to. Say, you know, I'd rather not answer that, but go check out X website and, you know, for more information. And because I do think it's important for people to understand that being an ally doesn't mean asking invasive questions. It means going out and doing the work yourself, and doing the research yourself, and educating yourself. So yeah, it's tough, but finding a subtle way to kind of point that out, or suggest that there are other resources out there that are tailor-made for that sort of situation, might be one way to go.
And, you know, I was smiling at that question because it's so relatable. Yeah, it's exhausting. I think all 5 of us here, field inclusive organizers, audit, we all can relate to that. It is exhausting, fatiguing. You know, I, for the most part, have just decided to be that person, to just do it. It's a personal decision I have made, because I view that, okay, if this makes the path easier for those that are behind me, you know, that are the next generation, then I'm willing to do it. I try to remember that the person's being well-meaning. They just don't know, and they just don't know who to go to. But as Katie said, yes, you can set boundaries. Yes, you can say, you know, that's a private matter. You can also say, and this is something I always tell people, is at least, you know, I'm just telling you my experience. I'm just telling you my perspective. And it's mine. I'm not speaking for the queer community. I don't have the experience of someone that's transgender, or identifies as a gay man, or even has multiple identities, who might be a person of color who's also queer. Their experience is going to be much different from mine. So I'm just going to, that's one caveat I always tell them. This is my perspective experience. It doesn't apply to every queer person you're going to meet. But yeah, I've just decided, honestly, to suck it up and talk to them.
Yeah.
But again, that's my decision.
Yeah, and that's where the same with me, and that's why Colleen and I are on here, and but again, that's a privilege of where we're at in our career, and you know, and our life stage, and totally understand it, and just you know, our personalities, I guess. You know, not everybody. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with not wanting to be that person. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
But hopefully the weight that is on all of us lessens over time. Again, as we are willing to be more visible, more vocal, doing events like this, having organizations such as OitF and Field Inclusive, maybe hopefully that we start to see that lift in the future, but it might take a while. But I've already seen a drastic change. You know, people are more cognizant, but yeah, it's going to take more work. But I'm sorry you're dealing with that. Hang in there. Hang in there.
No, on behalf of Field Inclusive, we want to say the same thing, that we, as Colleen mentioned, all of us on this call, we get it. We get it. We understand. And I would say, I think, speaking for my team, but you know, I'll speak for myself, that I feel like a mixture of what Colleen and Katie says, on top of, you know, what we stand for. We'll do some of the work, and then half of us is like, but also do your homework. But we're here to help if needed. But also kind of do your homework when you can. Oh, be super helpful. All right. Well, we are out of time today, but I want to thank our presenters once again for spending a little bit of extra time with us and answering those last few questions. So on behalf of Field Inclusive, I would like to thank Katie and Colleen once again for joining us today. And we thank you both for these wonderful presentations, and thank you once again for sharing your experiences and recommendations when it comes to the inclusivity of marginalized groups, particularly LGBTQ, queer, and femme presenting individuals, as well as highlighting the values that they bring bring to this field. Again, we thank those of you who joined us this morning. We will continue these conversations as we further our initiatives and work when it comes to amplifying social field safety issues, as well as amplifying minorities in STEM. Please be sure to follow and interact with us on all of our social media channels, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at the handle at Field Inclusive. Please also be sure to visit our website to learn more about our organization and ways that you as an individual can support our organization. This concludes our Field Inclusive Week 2024. So we went out with a bang. So thank you both once again. We hope you all enjoyed the week of fun online events, giveaways, and wonderful webinar speakers. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day today. And thank you again for joining us. Remember, stay safe and be inclusive. Thanks all.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.